Okay, today we are going to make one of these. This is a test lead, a jump wire with an alligator clip on one end and a needle on the other. With this we can like back probe into connectors, and then we have a fuse holder here to make sure that we don't melt this wire down by shorting a circuit out. This is also just going to help protect the circuits that we're testing. We've got a T-pin there that we're going to use. We have an alligator clip here that we're going to use. We have these heat shrink tubing or tubes that we're going to use. There's 3 of them about 1 inch long. We've got some wire, green, and there's some black out here too. Soldering iron. We have our solder in the back there on that blue spool, and our wire crimps and strippers. They both work. We have the heat gun here. It's going to shrink up the heat shrink tubing. And then we have our soldering iron tip cleaner. And you take your hot soldering iron tip and you poke that into that like Brillo pad, give it a little twist, and that will give us a nice clean soldering iron tip. A dirty one would be the one back there on the table behind us, or just down to the right under my hand. So that's all clean and good to go. We're going to take one of these fuse holders, and this is just a solid wire all the way around, so we need to cut it about halfway down. And we're just going to get everything ready. So we're going to take about 12 inches of the green wire. I'm not going to measure and grade you on how close you got, but ballpark about 12 inches, 1 foot of the green wire. And then we have our alligator clip, our T-pin, and our heat shrink tubing. We do need to get the head of the T-pin cut off, so I'm going to do that right here. Please watch your eyeballs. I'm kind of tentatively I'm kind of tentatively planning on cutting those off so that we're not hurting each other out in the shop, but we'll see how that goes. We do need to strip the ends of the wires off, and these are automatic. So we're just going to set these in here and squeeze the handles together. I will get this on the camera, I promise here. Just a sec. So I pushed the little stop out as far as it would go, and we need 2 joints at this distance. So I've pulled it. I just squeezed the trigger and or squeezed the handles, excuse me, and that pulled the insulation off of the wire. Okay, we got about 3/4 of an inch or so on each one of those, and those 2 are going to be going together. Now these other ends, the alligator clip is going to go on this end, and we want to pull about 1/4 of an inch off. So I adjust the depth stop here, and I pulled that off out of view of the camera, but it'll be here in just a sec. Right there, we got about 3/8 of an inch of wire exposed there, and we'll do the same on the green here. Just up to the depth stop and squeeze the handles, and we got about 3/8 of an inch. And that's where the needle is going to go. So next we're going to make a linesman splice. We're going to take the 2 long tails that we made, the 2 3/4 inch tails. We'll twist these up individually like that, just making sure we don't have any straggler wire strands. And then we lay them over each other in this X, and then we push the tails over one another. So we're twisting the wires around each other right now until the tail is gone, and you'll see that we don't have this big bulky joint there. We don't have a big tumor hanging off of the wire. It is about the width of the wire and insulation, and now we need to solder this up. So you'll see I use the crimpers and strippers just to hold the wire up. I don't actually have them like pinched. I just have the wire running through to hold everything stationary, and we need to touch the solder to the soldering iron tip to tin the tip because we've cleaned it. And now we want to hold that soldering iron against the wire long enough that the wire gets hot enough to melt the solder. We don't want to be pushing solder into the tip right now. We want to be getting that wire hot enough to melt the solder by itself. And even when I do that, I leave it on just a little bit longer. I leave the heat, the soldering iron on just a little bit longer to make sure that that solder can flow up into the wire and the insulation there. So this is a good solder joint, and now we need to get some heat shrink tubing on here. Okay, and again, I'm just kind of showing that the solder will actually wick up into the wire, and I've shown that during class. So we can slip our heat shrink tubing on now, and this is one of those joints that it doesn't really matter. We can slip it on after, but when we do the alligator clip on that other end of the wire in the frame there, we have to make sure to put the heat shrink tubing on first, because we cannot fit the heat shrink tubing on after. But we'll hit this with the heat. I do like to leave the heat on a little bit longer, even after it fully shrinks up. I leave the heat on it a little bit because this is adhesive lined heat shrink tubing, and I want to make sure that that adhesive inside actually melts well. Okay, so I'm gonna put the alligator clip on here, and how this typically works, it will be in focus here, I promise. So those little clips I usually use to grab onto the insulation, but because the insulation is so thick in this, on this wire, we're actually going to grab, so like that would be how I would typically do it. But because the insulation is so thick, we're actually just going to grab onto the wire itself. We're going to slip that heat shrink tubing on. We're going to twist that up. We'll set that in there. Now I'm actually going to pull it off because this didn't work like I wanted it to. I actually need to start folding those tangs over, and so I'm going to do that here on camera, show you what I'm doing. I kind of get one side bent over, and then I switch to the other side and get the other side bent over some. And when I get that kind of all folded over how I want it, I'm going to slip the wire into it. Now I had to pull this off of the crimpers because I just couldn't see what I was doing, but you'll see that it does slip right in there. Perfect. And then I'm going to crimp that up. And what I actually do is, just out of screen here, very useful, is I actually pinch the sides a little tighter, and then I go over the top and bottom and pinch really tight. The top and bottom are where I pinched really tight. The sides I just kind of folded in a little bit. And now that's nice and tight on the wire, and we need to get that soldered up. We are going to solder the connector on and then move the heat shrink tubing up. We're going to clean the tip of the soldering iron, and then we are going to tin the tip of the soldering iron. Then we need to get that heat on the wire until it's hot enough to melt the solder. Okay, and I'm going to make sure that we have plenty of solder on that joint. That smoke is from the flux inside of that solder, and that flux helps that solder flow and stick to the wire. So we have that. I'm trying to show here, but my wrist is what's being focused on here. We have a nice shiny solder joint there, and that's a good sign that we have a solid solder joint. If it was like dull gray, it's typically an indication of a cold solder joint, so the solder didn't get hot enough to flow as well as we would need it to. I'm going to shrink this heat shrink tubing down with the heat gun, and we are done with the alligator clip. And we've got our alligator clip, we have our linesman splice that's all soldered up, and then now we need to put the needle on this end. And the way that I do that is I'm just going to take the needle, and this is the end that I cut off, so the pointy end is actually pressing against my index finger right now, and I just kind of wiggle it down into the wire some. Once I get it into about the middle of the wire, I'm just going to twist the wire around it, and you will see that it actually holds on really tight. This isn't like a balancing act. It's not like be really careful and it might fall out while I'm trying to solder it. It's actually holding on really well being twisted in there like that. I'm going to set this back up in my crimpers and tin the tip of the soldering iron, and then I'm going to solder this joint. Okay, just touching the wire. The wire got hot enough to do that, or to melt the solder. I leave the soldering iron there for a minute to make sure that we continue to allow all that solder to flow where it wants to. And then we're going to slip our heat shrink tubing on over, use the heat gun to shrink that down, and we are all done. So what I would like you to do is, when you've completed this, this is yours to keep. And I would love for you to take this home and keep this forever. I still have one that I made in college in my toolbox that I still grab. These are super useful if you do anything electrical, anything low voltage, anything 12 volt. I love having this. And so this is yours to take home. I'm not going to make you take it home, but what I really would like you to do is make sure to give it to me, Mr. Long, and that way we don't have multiple people turning in your work. I would like you to turn your work in and then give it to me, and then that makes sure that everybody else has to do this project, and there's no just taking pictures of someone else's. So with that, take a picture of this, please, and put that picture in the PowerPoint presentation for this Station 10, and then submit that on Schoology for grading, please. And with that, enjoy your tester. Don't burn stuff down.